When the radio went silent at 0347 hours, nobody could have imagined that Frank Merrill was already dead, and that his death would save 3,000 American lives before dawn. The Burma jungle doesn't forgive mistakes. At 2:30 a.m., March 15, 1944, Brigadier General Frank Merrill pressed his back against the wet bark of a teak tree and listened to 23 Japanese soldiers searching for him in the darkness. Their whispered commands drifted through the humid air like death sentences, each word bringing them closer to discovering the most dangerous secret in the Pacific Theater. Frank wasn't supposed to be here. None of his marauders were supposed to be here. According to official records, the 5,307th Composite Unit was 300 miles south, conducting reconnaissance near Myitkyina. But Frank had learned something in his 28 years of military service that no manual taught. Sometimes you had to die to win. The first Japanese soldier passed within arm's reach of Frank's position, close enough that Frank could smell the man's sweat and see the nervous tremor in his rifle barrel. The young soldier, probably no older than 19, swept his flashlight beam in careful arcs, professional and thorough. He was good. But Frank had been hunting men in jungles since before this kid was born. What the Japanese soldier didn't know would determine whether Frank Merrill's 3,000 men lived or died in the next 4 hours. Frank's radio operator, Sergeant Tommy Morrison, was hidden 40 yards deeper in the jungle with intelligence that could end the war in Burma 6 months early. But getting that intelligence to Allied headquarters meant surviving the next 10 minutes, and the Japanese patrol was systematically closing every escape route. The flashlight beam swung toward Frank's tree. In 3 seconds, 23 enemy soldiers would know exactly where the most wanted American in Southeast Asia was hiding. Frank made his choice. He stepped into the light. "I surrender," Frank called out in perfect Japanese, his hands raised above his head. The young soldier's flashlight beam locked onto Frank's face, illuminating the weathered features of a man who had spent 4 months behind enemy lines. Frank's uniform was torn and mud-stained, his face gone from surviving on half rations and willpower. He looked exactly like what the Japanese expected, a broken American officer at the end of his endurance. "You are the leader of the Ghost Unit," the soldier said in accented English. It wasn't a question. Frank nodded slowly. "Brigadier General Frank Merrill, 5,307th Composite Unit, United States Army. Service number 0-2016847. But what Frank didn't say would have terrified the Japanese more than any weapon in their arsenal. The young soldier lowered his rifle, smugness creeping into his expression. Capturing Frank Merrill would be the crowning achievement of his military career. The ghost commander who had made Japanese supply lines bleed for 4 months was finally in their hands. He radioed his commanding officer with the news point. 3 minutes later, Colonel Tanaka arrived with 2 trucks full of soldiers and an expression of barely controlled excitement. Tanaka was a veteran of the China campaign, a professional who understood the value of Frank's capture. "General Merrill," Tanaka said in excellent English. "Your reputation precedes you. My men have nicknamed you Kage, Shadow. You have cost us many lives." Frank met his gaze steadily. "That was the idea, Colonel." Tanaka smiled coldly. "And now your shadow war is over. You will tell us the locations of your remaining units, the positions of your supply bases, and the details of your communication networks. I'll tell you name, rank, and serial number. Nothing else. We shall see." As the Japanese soldiers bound Frank's hands with rough rope, none of them noticed the subtle hand signal he flashed toward the darkness. 3 quick movements that meant, "Proceed as planned," in the sign language Frank had developed for silent jungle operations. Tommy Morrison, hidden in the undergrowth with the intelligence that could save 3,000 American lives, began his race against time. What Frank Merrill had discovered 3 days earlier would have been impossible to believe, except that he'd seen it with his own eyes. While conducting what should have been routine reconnaissance near Myitkyina, Frank's patrol had stumbled onto the largest Japanese troop concentration in Burma, but it wasn't the size of the force that made Frank's blood run cold, it was where they were going. 15,000 Japanese soldiers, supported by artillery and armor, were moving north through supposedly impassable jungle terrain. Their destination, the Allied supply base at Lido, where 3,000 American support personnel had no idea they were about to face the largest Japanese offensive since Pearl Harbor. The attack was scheduled for dawn, March 16, less than 4 hours away. Frank's radio operator had photographed the Japanese battle plans with a captured enemy camera. The intelligence was devastating, detailed maps showing every Allied position, supply route, and defensive weakness around Lido. If those plans reached Japanese headquarters, the base would fall within hours, but there was one problem that might save 3,000 American lives. The Japanese high command didn't know their battle plans had been compromised. They believed Frank's unit was still 300 miles south, exactly where Allied headquarters thought they were. Frank's impossible gambit was to make sure the Japanese never suspected their plans had been discovered. Getting captured wasn't part of the original plan, but it might be the only way to ensure Tommy Morrison escaped with the intelligence. As long as the Japanese believed they had captured the real Frank Merrill, they wouldn't search too carefully for his radio operator, but Frank knew something that would have chilled Tommy Morrison to the bone. Even if the sergeant reached Allied lines with the intelligence, there wouldn't be enough time to organize an effective defense. 3,000 Americans were going to die unless Frank could delay the Japanese attack, and Frank Merrill, tied up in the back of a Japanese truck, was about to become the most dangerous prisoner of war in the Pacific Theater. "Your men call you the Ghost Commander," Colonel Tanaka said as the truck convoy wound through the jungle toward Japanese headquarters. "But ghosts cannot be captured, General Merrill. Perhaps you are not as supernatural as your reputation suggests." Frank said nothing, but his mind was racing through calculations. The convoy was moving northeast, toward the Japanese forward command post. The route would take them within 2 miles of the Lido supply base, close enough for Frank to observe the final preparations for the attack. More importantly, the convoy was using the exact road that would be the main Japanese supply line once the offensive began. If Frank could create chaos here, at the right moment, he might be able to disrupt the entire operation. "You are very quiet, General," Tanaka observed. "Are you perhaps contemplating the interrogation that awaits you?" Frank finally spoke. "I'm wondering how you found us, Colonel. We've been operating in this sector for 3 weeks without detection." Tanaka's smile was predatory. "Your operations have a pattern, General. Your raids follow a mathematical progression that my intelligence staff identified. You attack supply depots in sequence, working your way north along established routes. Predictable. But what Tanaka didn't know would cost the Japanese Empire everything they'd worked toward in Burma. Frank had been deliberately establishing that pattern for 6 weeks, conducting raids that looked random but were actually designed to draw Japanese attention away from their real objective. Every attack had been calculated to make the Japanese think the Marauders were just another disruption unit, not a strategic intelligence operation. The truck hit a pothole, jolting Frank against the wooden bench. His wrists were already raw from the rope bindings, but he barely noticed the pain. His attention was focused on the sounds outside the convoy: engine noises, radio chatter, the distinctive creak of armored vehicles moving through jungle terrain. A lot of armored vehicles. Through gaps in the truck's canvas cover, Frank caught glimpses of the Japanese force preparing for the dawn offensive. Tanks camouflaged with jungle vegetation. Artillery pieces being maneuvered into firing positions. Thousands of soldiers moving with the coordinated efficiency of a well-planned military operation. The Japanese were even stronger than Frank's intelligence had suggested. Impressive, isn't it? Tanaka had noticed Frank's observations. 15,000 men, 64 armored vehicles, 38 artillery pieces. More than enough to crush your supply base. Frank forced his expression to remain neutral, but internally he was recalculating the threat assessment. The Japanese had reinforced their attack force since his patrol's original reconnaissance. 3,000 American support personnel weren't just facing a major offensive, they were facing complete annihilation, and somewhere in the jungle darkness, Tommy Morrison was racing toward Allied lines with intelligence that was already outdated. The truck convoy rolled deeper into Japanese-controlled territory, carrying Frank toward an interrogation he might not survive. But Frank Merrill had been dead since 03:47 hours, when his radio went silent. Everything after that was borrowed time, and Frank intended to spend every second of it making the Japanese pay for their victory. The Japanese forward command post was a marvel of military engineering hidden beneath the jungle canopy. Canvas shelters camouflaged with local vegetation housed radio equipment, map tables, and ammunition stores. Generators hummed quietly, providing power for communications equipment that linked this remote outpost to every Japanese unit in Burma. Frank was dragged from the truck and pushed toward the largest shelter, where Colonel Tanaka's superior was waiting. General Yamashita was a legend in the Imperial Japanese Army, the officer who had conquered Singapore, the architect of Japan's early Pacific victories. Seeing him in a forward command post 90 miles behind Allied lines demonstrated just how important the Japanese considered this offensive. "General Merrill," Yamashita said in flawless English. "I am honored to meet the officer who has caused us so much inconvenience." Frank studied the men who had outmaneuvered the British Empire and nearly destroyed American forces in the Philippines. Yamashita was smaller than Frank had expected, but his eyes held the intelligence and ruthlessness that had made him one of Japan's most successful commanders. "The honor is yours, General," Frank replied. "I've heard about Singapore." Yamashita's smile was thin. "And I have heard about your ghost tactics. Very innovative. Your ability to strike without warning, to disappear without trace, has forced us to modify our entire tactical approach in Burma." But what Frank saw in the command shelter made him realize the Japanese had been planning more than just a single offensive. The map table displayed the entire Burma theater, marked with Japanese positions, Allied locations, and proposed attack routes. But the markers weren't just for the Lido offensive, they showed coordinated attacks planned across 600 miles of front line. Frank forced himself not to react, but his mind was reeling. The Lido attack wasn't an isolated operation. It was the first move in a massive Japanese counteroffensive designed to push Allied forces completely out of Burma. "You understand now," Yamashita said, noticing Frank's careful examination of the maps. "Your little raids, your supply depot attacks, your ghost tactics, they have been entertaining, but ultimately irrelevant. In 72 hours, we will control every Allied position between here and the Indian border." Frank's voice was steady when he replied. "That's an ambitious plan, General. History suggests that ambitious plans in Burma tend to fail. History is written by victors, General Merrill. And in 72 hours, history will record that Japan completed what it began at Pearl Harbor." Yamashita's confidence wasn't just military bravado, it was based on intelligence that should have been impossible for the Japanese to obtain. "Your Allied commanders believe our forces are scattered, weakened by months of your harassment raids," Yamashita continued. "They have no idea we have been concentrating strength for this offensive. No idea that we know the exact location and strength of every Allied unit in Burma." Frank's blood turned cold. The Japanese weren't just planning a surprise attack, they had detailed intelligence on Allied positions. Either they had broken Allied communication codes, or they had agents providing information from inside Allied headquarters. "You look troubled, General," Yamashita observed. "Perhaps you are realizing that your shadow war has been conducted in the light all along." Before Frank could respond, a communications officer approached with a radio message. The man whispered urgently in Japanese, his expression troubled. Yamashita's face darkened as he read the message. He looked up at Frank with renewed suspicion. "It seems one of your men has been spotted near our perimeter. My patrols are pursuing an American soldier carrying what appears to be photographic equipment. Tommy Morrison had been discovered." Frank's mind raced through tactical possibilities, none of them good. If the Japanese captured Tommy Morrison with the photographed intelligence, they would know their battle plans had been compromised. They would change their attack timing, their routes, their entire operational approach, but they would still attack, and 3,000 Americans would still die. "This soldier," Frank said carefully. "Did your men capture him?" Yamashita's smile was predatory. "Not yet. But he is surrounded. My patrols will have him within the hour." Frank needed to buy Tommy time, but any information he provided would confirm Japanese suspicions about Allied intelligence operations. He made a calculated decision. "Colonel, your men are chasing shadows. I've been operating alone for the past 72 hours. No backup, no radio operator, no support personnel. You expect me to believe you conducted reconnaissance on our positions without assistance? I expect you to believe what your intelligence tells you. Check your radio intercepts. You'll find no communications from my unit for the past 3 days because there are no communications. I've been operating under radio silence since crossing into your territory." It was a dangerous bluff, but Frank was counting on Japanese thoroughness. If they checked their communication intercepts and found silence from his unit, it might support his story. Yamashita gestured to his communications officer, who quickly consulted a folder of intercepted radio traffic. After several minutes, the officer whispered something to Yamashita that made the general's expression shift from suspicion to confusion. "Interesting," Yamashita said slowly. "You are correct. We have detected no Allied communications from this sector for 78 hours. Either you are telling the truth about operating alone, or your radio discipline is exceptional." Frank forced himself to remain motionless while his heart hammered against his ribs. The bluff was working, but Tommy Morrison was still out there with 15 Japanese soldiers closing in on his position. "General," Frank said, "I have a proposition." Yamashita raised an eyebrow. "You are hardly in a position to negotiate, General Merrill. I'm in a position to save both our forces unnecessary casualties. You have the intelligence advantage, superior numbers, and tactical surprise. Your offensive will succeed regardless of what I tell you or don't tell you. Continue." Frank was about to make the most dangerous gamble of his military career. "Let me communicate with my headquarters. Let me order my remaining units to withdraw from your operational area. In exchange, I'll provide you with detailed information about Allied defensive positions around Lido." Yamashita's eyes narrowed. "And why would you make such an offer?" "Because 3,000 support personnel at Lido are going to die tomorrow morning unless they receive evacuation orders. They're not combat troops, General. They're mechanics, cooks, drivers, medics. Killing them won't advance your military objectives." The shelter fell silent except for the humming of generators and the distant sound of Japanese soldiers preparing for the offensive. Frank could see Yamashita weighing the proposal, calculating the advantages and risks. "You would betray your own forces to save non-combatant personnel. I would provide tactically irrelevant information to prevent a massacre of support personnel who pose no threat to your operations." But Frank's real plan was far more complex than Yamashita could have imagined. "Very well," Yamashita said finally. "You may send one radio message to your headquarters. My communications officer will monitor the transmission to ensure you provide only evacuation orders." Frank nodded. "I'll need to use standard Allied communication protocols. Military shorthand that your officer might not recognize. Our communications specialists are quite competent, General Merrill. They will detect any attempt to convey tactical intelligence." What Yamashita didn't know was that Frank Merrill had developed a private communication code with Allied headquarters 6 months earlier, a code based on seemingly routine military terminology that could convey complex tactical information without detection. Frank was led to the radio equipment, where a Japanese communications specialist prepared to monitor his transmission. The man was clearly experienced, wearing headphones and taking detailed notes of everything Frank said. "Allied Command, this is Ghost 6, Frank spoke into the microphone. Authentication Charlie 77 Romeo." The response came back immediately. "Ghost 6, this is Allied Command. Confirm authentication. We show you as radio silent for 78 hours. Affirmative, Command. Request immediate evacuation of support personnel from Lido base. Condition read, operational necessity." There was a pause before the response came back. "Ghost 6, confirm reason for evacuation request." Frank took a deep breath and began transmitting the most important message of his military career. "Command, recommend evacuation due to supply route contamination. Estimate 15 units of contaminated material, 64 degrees concentration, 38% saturation. Contamination moving north at standard rate, arrival dawn +0. To the Japanese communication specialist, Frank was describing a medical emergency, contaminated supplies requiring evacuation of personnel. But Allied Command would understand the real message: 15,000 enemy soldiers, 64 armored vehicles, 38 artillery pieces, moving north, attacking at dawn. Ghost 6, understood. Evacuation orders will be issued immediately. What is your current status?" Frank glanced at Yamashita, who was listening carefully but showing no signs of suspicion. "Command, Ghost 6 is contained pending medical evaluation. Expect no further communications until contamination situation is resolved." "Understood, Ghost 6. Medical evacuation team will be dispatched. Stay strong." The transmission ended, and Yamashita nodded approvingly. "Very professional, General. Your support personnel will be evacuated, and my forces will face only legitimate military targets." Frank had successfully warned Allied headquarters about the Japanese offensive and ensured the evacuation of 3,000 non-combat personnel. But he had also revealed his position to enemy forces and condemned himself to whatever interrogation methods Yamashita chose to employ. And somewhere in the jungle darkness, Tommy Morrison was still running for his life with photographic evidence that could end the war in Burma. The evacuation of Lido base began 27 minutes after Frank's radio transmission. 3,000 support personnel who had been sleeping peacefully in their barracks suddenly found themselves loading onto trucks and aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying only essential equipment and personal items. Frank watched the evacuation through high-powered binoculars from Yamashita's command post, relief washing over him as he saw the organized chaos of a successful emergency evacuation. Whatever happened to him in the next few hours, those 3,000 Americans would live to see another day. Remarkable efficiency, Yamashita observed, standing beside Frank and watching the same scene. Your Allied command structure responds quickly to crisis situations. When the stakes are high enough, Frank replied, but Frank was also watching for something else, any sign of Tommy Morrison among the vehicles leaving the base. His radio operator should have reached Allied lines by now, should have delivered the photographic intelligence that would allow Allied forces to prepare proper defenses. Instead, Frank saw something that made his blood turn to ice. A truck convoy was moving toward the now evacuated base from the south, Japanese vehicles approaching under cover of darkness, 3 hours ahead of the planned offensive schedule. General, Frank said carefully, your attack appears to be beginning early. Yamashita lowered his binoculars, his expression shifting from satisfaction to concern. That is not possible. The offensive is scheduled for dawn, 36 minutes from now. Then perhaps you should contact your field commanders, because those are definitely Japanese vehicles approaching the base. Yamashita immediately ordered his communications officer to raise all field commanders. The radio chatter that followed revealed a disturbing truth. Japanese units throughout the operational area were reporting unauthorized movement toward their targets. The carefully coordinated offensive was beginning to fracture before it even started. Sir, the communications officer reported, advance elements from 3 different commands are approaching their objectives. They report coming under fire from Allied forces who appear to be prepared for attack. Yamashita's face darkened as he realized what was happening. The evacuation was not medical. It was tactical. Allied forces knew about our offensive. Frank said nothing, but Yamashita's next words chilled him to the bone. Which means the soldier my patrols are pursuing was carrying intelligence, not just conducting routine reconnaissance. The general turned to his communications officer. Contact all patrol units. The American soldier being pursued is to be captured alive at all costs. He is carrying classified intelligence that has compromised our entire operation. Frank knew that Tommy Morrison was now the most hunted man in Burma. 15 Japanese patrols would be converging on his position, and his chances of reaching Allied lines had just dropped to nearly 0. But Frank also knew something that might save both Tommy's life and the Allied defensive effort. The Japanese were about to make the same mistake that had cost them the Battle of Midway. They were about to divide their forces at the worst possible moment. General Yamashita, Frank said, I have another proposition. Yamashita turned from the radio equipment, his expression dangerous. You have already provided enough surprises for one evening, General Merrill. This one might save both our forces from a pointless slaughter. Explain. Frank gestured toward the radio equipment that was crackling with confused communications from Japanese field commanders. Your offensive is compromised, but it's not defeated. My intelligence reached Allied headquarters, but they don't have enough time to mount a coordinated defense. You still have superior numbers and firepower. But now we lack surprise, and surprise was the foundation of our tactical plan. Then modify the plan. Use the intelligence compromise to your advantage. Yamashita's eyes narrowed. I am listening. Frank moved to the map table, aware that every word he spoke could be considered treason by Allied command. But 3,000 support personnel were safely evacuated, and now Frank needed to prevent a chaotic battle that would cost thousands of lives on both sides. Allied command knows you're coming, but they don't know your exact strength or approach routes. They're preparing defenses based on standard Japanese tactical doctrine, not the specific plan you've developed. Frank traced routes on the map with his finger. They expect a frontal assault on prepared positions. They expect you to follow the main supply roads. They expect conventional infantry tactics. And you suggest. Frank was about to provide Yamashita with the tactical advice that would save thousands of Japanese lives, and potentially hand Japan a major victory in Burma. Do exactly what they don't expect. Attack from the east, through terrain they consider impassable. Use your armor as mobile artillery, not as assault vehicles. Bypass their prepared positions and cut their supply lines instead of attacking their defensive perimeter. Yamashita studied the map in silence for several minutes. The tactical advice was sound, brilliant, even. It would require significant modification of the operational plan, but it might salvage victory from the compromised offensive. And in exchange for this tactical consultation, Yamashita said slowly, "You want what?" "Safe passage for my radio operator. He's carrying photographic intelligence that belongs in Allied hands, just as this tactical advice belongs in yours." Professional soldiers sharing professional knowledge. It was a dangerous game Frank was playing, providing an enemy commander with tactical advice in exchange for saving an Allied soldier's life. But Frank had seen too many battles where tactical incompetence on both sides turned military objectives into meaningless slaughter. "You would give me victory to save one soldier. I would give you tactical efficiency to prevent unnecessary casualties on both sides. You're going to win this engagement regardless of what I tell you, the question is whether you win cleanly or messily." But Frank was gambling everything on an assumption that might be completely wrong. Yamashita's decision would determine whether Frank Merrill died as a prisoner of war or as a military consultant. It would also determine whether Tommy Morrison lived long enough to deliver the photographic intelligence that could change the entire Burma campaign. "Your proposal is unorthodox," Yamashita said finally. "But your tactical analysis is correct. A modified approach would minimize casualties while maintaining operational effectiveness." Frank felt a surge of relief that he carefully kept from showing on his face. "However," Yamashita continued, "I require additional information. Your radio operator, what specific intelligence is he carrying?" Frank had expected this question, and his answer would determine whether Yamashita honored their agreement. "Photographic documentation of your troop concentrations, artillery positions, and supply routes. Standard reconnaissance intelligence that allowed Allied command to identify the scope of your offensive." It was partially true, Tommy was carrying those photographs. But Frank didn't mention the captured Japanese battle plans that would allow Allied forces to predict every tactical decision Yamashita might make. And this intelligence is why Allied forces were prepared for our attack. Partially. The intelligence provided confirmation of what Allied command already suspected, that you were concentrating forces for a major offensive. It didn't provide the tactical details that would have allowed them to mount an effective defense. Frank was walking a tightrope between truth and deception, providing enough information to maintain Yamashita's trust without revealing the full extent of Allied intelligence capabilities. Yamashita studied Frank's face, looking for signs of deception. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "Very well. I will order my patrols to allow your radio operator to reach Allied lines. In exchange, you will provide detailed consultation on the modified tactical approach." Frank extended his hand. "Deal." Yamashita shook it, two professional soldiers reaching an understanding that transcended national loyalties, but as Yamashita turned to issue orders to his communications officer, Frank caught a glimpse of something on the map table that made his heart skip a beat. A red pin marking a location 15 miles southeast of their current position. Next to it, a notation in Japanese characters that Frank couldn't read, but the accompanying numbers were clear enough, 0600 hours, March 16th. There was another part of the Japanese offensive that Frank hadn't known about. While the main attack force moved on Lido, a second Japanese unit was positioned to attack Allied supply convoys moving north from India. Tommy Morrison, racing toward Allied lines with the captured intelligence, was running directly into a Japanese ambush scheduled to begin in 37 minutes. Frank had saved Tommy from the patrols pursuing him, but he had inadvertently directed him toward an even deadlier trap. "General Yamashita," Frank said, trying to keep the urgency out of his voice, "there's one detail we need to discuss about my radio operator's route to Allied lines." Yamashita looked up from the radio equipment where he had been issuing new tactical orders to his field commanders. "What detail?" "The safest route from his current position passes through the Mogaung Valley. I assume your forces aren't operating in that area." Yamashita's expression didn't change, but Frank caught a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "Why would you assume that, General Merrill?" "Because it's the most obvious route for someone trying to reach Allied lines quickly. If I were planning to intercept escaped Allied personnel, I would avoid that area to maintain the illusion of safety." It was a calculated fishing expedition, and Frank knew he was risking everything on Yamashita's reaction. "Your tactical thinking is sound," Yamashita said carefully. "However, my planning has been more comprehensive than you might expect." Frank's worst fears were confirmed. The Japanese had anticipated Allied escape routes and positioned forces to intercept anyone trying to reach Allied lines with intelligence. "General," Frank said, "our agreement was for safe passage. And safe passage you shall have. I will issue orders for your radio operator to be allowed through our perimeter. However, I cannot control Allied movements or tactical decisions. If your radio operator encounters other operational elements," Yamashita let the implication hang in the air. Frank realized he had been outmaneuvered. Yamashita would honor the letter of their agreement. Tommy would be allowed through Japanese perimeter defenses. But the ambush in Mogaung Valley was a separate operation, technically outside the scope of their deal. Frank needed to find a way to warn Tommy Morrison without revealing to Yamashita that he knew about the ambush. "I'd like to send one more radio transmission," Frank said, "to confirm that my radio operator received earlier evacuation orders." Yamashita considered this request. "One transmission. 30 seconds maximum. No tactical information." Frank nodded and moved to the radio equipment. The Japanese communications specialist put on his headphones, ready to monitor every word. "Ghost 7, this is Ghost 6, Frank transmitted, using Tommy Morrison's call sign. There was static for several seconds before Tommy's voice came through, breathless and tense. "Ghost 6, this is Ghost 7. Confirm your transmission." Frank had 30 seconds to save Tommy Morrison's life without alerting Yamashita to the existence of the Mogaung Valley ambush. "Ghost 7, confirm package delivery via alternate route. Recommend Delta approach, avoid primary corridor due to traffic congestion." To the Japanese monitor, Frank was recommending an alternate delivery route to avoid congested supply roads. But Tommy would understand the real message: avoid the primary escape route because of enemy forces. "Ghost 6, understand alternate route. Package delivery on schedule. Ghost 7 out." The transmission ended, and Frank stepped back from the radio equipment. Yamashita nodded approvingly. "Professional and efficient. Your radio operator will reach Allied lines safely." But Frank knew that Tommy was now faced with an impossible choice: take the primary route through Mogaung Valley and walk into a Japanese ambush, or take an alternate route that would delay his arrival at Allied lines by at least 6 hours. 6 hours that might be too late to prevent the modified Japanese offensive from achieving complete tactical surprise. Frank had saved Tommy's life, but he might have cost the Allies their last chance to mount an effective defense. The first Japanese artillery shells began falling on evacuated Allied positions at exactly 0600 hours, March 16, 1944. Frank watched the bombardment through binoculars from Yamashita's command post, counting the muzzle flashes and calculating the destructive potential of 64 artillery pieces firing in coordinated sequence. If 3,000 support personnel had still been sleeping in those barracks, the first 10 minutes of the bombardment would have killed more Americans than any single engagement since Pearl Harbor. "Effective preliminary bombardment," Frank observed, speaking with the professional detachment of a military analyst. "Precisely timed and coordinated," Yamashita agreed. "My artillery commanders have trained extensively for this operation." But Frank noticed something about the bombardment pattern that Yamashita apparently had not. The shells were falling on empty positions. Allied forces had not only evacuated non-combat personnel, they had withdrawn all defensive elements from the primary target area. "General," Frank said carefully, "your artillery is very accurate, but you might want to confirm that you're hitting occupied positions." Yamashita raised his own binoculars and studied the target area more carefully. After several minutes of observation, his expression shifted from satisfaction to concern. "Communications," he called to his radio operator. "Contact forward observers. I need confirmation of enemy casualties and defensive response." The radio chatter that followed revealed what Frank had already suspected: Allied forces had completely abandoned the positions the Japanese had spent months planning to attack. The elaborate bombardment was striking empty buildings and abandoned equipment. The evacuation Frank had ordered had been far more comprehensive than anyone had realized. "Sir," the communications officer reported, "forward observers report no return fire, no casualties, no indication of enemy presence in the target area." Yamashita lowered his binoculars, his face dark with realization. They didn't just evacuate support personnel. They evacuated everything. Frank said nothing, but internally he was recalculating the tactical situation. Allied command had used the 3 hours between Frank's warning and the Japanese attack to conduct a complete strategic withdrawal. Instead of trying to defend prepared positions against superior numbers, they had moved their entire defensive force to locations the Japanese hadn't reconnoitered. "Your intelligence was more valuable than you indicated," Yamashita said, his voice carrying a note of grudging respect. Allied command used the warning time very effectively. "Professional soldiers adapt to changing circumstances," Frank replied. "On both sides." But Frank was also realizing something that chilled him. If Allied forces had withdrawn completely from the Lido area, where had they repositioned? And were they now positioned to intercept Tommy Morrison as he tried to reach Allied lines with the captured intelligence? The war was becoming more complex by the hour, and Frank was no longer certain whether his decisions had saved lives or simply relocated the slaughter to a different time and place. A radio transmission interrupted his calculations, and brought news that would change everything. "Sir," Yamashita's communications officer called urgently, "we're receiving a transmission on Allied emergency frequencies." Yamashita and Frank both moved to the radio equipment, where the officer was monitoring what sounded like standard Allied military communications. "Allied Command, this is Ghost 7. Package delivered successfully. Contents confirmed and distributed. Repeat, package delivered successfully." Frank felt a surge of relief. Tommy Morrison had reached Allied lines safely and delivered the photographic intelligence. But the next part of the transmission made Frank's blood run cold. "Ghost 7, this is Allied Command. Confirm package contents include operational plans as well as reconnaissance data." "Affirmative, Command. Complete operational documentation recovered and authenticated." Yamashita slowly turned to look at Frank, his expression shifting from professional respect to cold fury. "Operational plans, General Merrill. You told me your radio operator was carrying reconnaissance photographs." Frank forced himself to meet Yamashita's gaze steadily. "I told you he was carrying photographic documentation of your troop concentrations and artillery positions. I didn't specify what other materials might have been photographed." "You photographed our battle plans. My radio operator photographed whatever intelligence was available at the time. Standard operating procedure for reconnaissance missions." Frank had just revealed that Allied forces now possessed complete documentation of Japanese operational plans, including the Mogaung Valley ambush and every other element of the Burma offensive. Yamashita's reaction was swift and decisive. "Communications, send immediate orders to all commands, abort current operations, implement contingency plan Delta, all units to rally point 7. Frank realized he was witnessing something remarkable, a general officer completely scrapping a major offensive and implementing alternative plans in real time. Yamashita was demonstrating the kind of tactical flexibility that had made him one of Japan's most successful commanders. "Contingency plan Delta?" Frank asked. "Something you haven't seen, General. Something your photographic intelligence couldn't have captured because it existed only in my mind until this moment." Yamashita moved to the map table and began issuing rapid orders to his staff. Within minutes, the carefully coordinated offensive that had taken months to plan was being dismantled and replaced with something entirely different. "You have cost me tactical surprise, General Merrill. But surprise is only one element of military strategy. Superior numbers, better positioning, and professional execution can overcome compromised intelligence." Frank watched in fascination as Yamashita transformed the Japanese operational approach in real time. Instead of attacking Allied positions, Japanese forces would withdraw to defensive positions and force Allied units to attack superior numbers in prepared defenses. It was a brilliant tactical adaptation that might still result in Japanese victory despite the compromised intelligence. "General," Frank said, "you're turning an offensive operation into a defensive one. That requires completely different logistics, different timing, different coordination. Which is why I have been planning contingency operations since we began this offensive." A wise commander always prepares for the possibility that his primary plan will be compromised. Frank realized he was facing an opponent who was not only tactically brilliant but strategically adaptable. Yamashita had anticipated that the offensive might be discovered and had prepared alternative approaches. "Your radio operator may have delivered our operational plans to Allied command," Yamashita continued, "but those plans are now irrelevant. Allied forces will spend precious time preparing defenses against attacks that will never come, while we establish killing fields and terrain of our choosing." Frank understood that the chess game was far from over. Yamashita was demonstrating why he had earned his reputation as one of Japan's most dangerous commanders. But Frank also realized that he still had one more move to make. "General Yamashita," Frank said, "I have one more proposition." Yamashita paused in his tactical planning to look at Frank with curiosity and wariness. "You have already provided quite enough surprises for one operation, General Merrill. This one might prevent the war in Burma from lasting another year. Explain." Frank moved to the map table, aware that his next words would either end the immediate crisis or escalate it into something far more dangerous. "Your contingency plan is tactically sound, but it has one strategic flaw: it assumes Allied forces will cooperate by attacking your prepared positions. What if they don't? Allied command has no choice. They cannot allow our forces to remain in this position indefinitely. Eventually, they must attack. Or they could withdraw completely from Burma and establish defensive positions in India, forcing you to attack across increasingly extended supply lines." Yamashita's expression shifted as he considered this possibility. A complete Allied withdrawal would force Japanese forces to occupy and defend vast territories with limited resources and increasingly tenuous supply lines. "You suggest they would abandon Burma entirely?" "I suggest they would trade territory for time, exactly as you're now trading immediate tactical advantage for long-term strategic position." Frank gestured to the map, indicating the vast distances involved in Burma operations. "Your forces are already operating at the extreme range of your supply capabilities. If Allied forces withdraw to India and you're forced to occupy all of Burma, your supply lines become impossibly extended. You win the territory but lose the strategic advantage." Frank was describing a scenario that would trap Japanese forces in an unwinnable position, controlling territory they couldn't adequately supply or defend. Yamashita studied the map in silence for several minutes, calculating distances, supply requirements, and defensive capabilities. "And your proposition?" he asked finally. "A limited engagement. Controlled objectives, defined scope, agreed upon conclusion. You establish Japanese control over specific tactical objectives, Allied forces establish defensive positions in defensible terrain, and both sides avoid the kind of extended warfare that bleeds both forces white." It was an extraordinary proposal, essentially asking an enemy commander to agree to limited warfare instead of pursuing total victory. "You ask me to accept partial victory when total victory might be possible. I ask you to accept strategic efficiency instead of tactical gambling. Your forces achieve their objectives, my forces avoid annihilation, and both our commands can redeploy resources to more critical theaters." Frank knew he was proposing something that might be considered treason by Allied command, negotiating operational limitations with an enemy commander. But he also knew that unlimited warfare in Burma might cost both sides thousands of casualties for minimal strategic gain. Yamashita's decision would determine whether the Burma campaign continued as a war of attrition or evolved into something more strategically rational. "General Merrill," Yamashita said slowly, "your proposal assumes that military commanders have the authority to determine strategic objectives. We are both bound by orders from higher command. We are both bound by professional obligations to achieve our objectives efficiently. How we achieve those objectives is, within limits, our decision." Frank was gambling that Yamashita, like many professional military officers, was more interested in tactical efficiency than in political ideology. "A limited engagement would require communication with both command structures," Yamashita observed. "Your superiors would need to approve any operational limitations. As would yours. But professional soldiers can present tactical recommendations that make strategic sense." The conversation was interrupted by urgent radio communications from Japanese field commanders reporting that Allied forces were indeed withdrawing from forward positions, but not in the direction Yamashita had expected. Allied forces were moving east, toward the Chinese border, instead of west toward India. Frank realized that Tommy Morrison's intelligence delivery had triggered a strategic decision that neither he nor Yamashita had anticipated. Allied command wasn't preparing to defend Burma or withdraw to India. They were repositioning for operations that extended far beyond the Burma theater. The war was expanding, and both Frank and Yamashita were about to become small pieces in a much larger strategic game. 6 months later, Brigadier General Frank Merrill stood in the ruins of what had been Yamashita's forward command post, now occupied by Allied forces advancing toward the Chinese border. The Burma campaign had evolved exactly as neither commander had predicted, into a mobile war of maneuver that stretched supply lines and tested tactical flexibility on both sides. The intelligence Tommy Morrison had delivered had indeed changed the course of the war, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of enabling Allied defensive operations, it had provided the foundation for a coordinated offensive that linked Burma operations with Chinese forces operating from the north. Frank's death, at 0347 hours on March 15, had become a legend among the marauders. The ghost commander who had vanished into enemy territory and somehow managed to save 3,000 Allied lives while redirecting an entire campaign. The truth was more complex and more troubling. Frank had learned that modern warfare was too complex for traditional concepts of loyalty and duty. Professional soldiers increasingly found themselves making decisions that transcended national boundaries, decisions based on tactical efficiency rather than political ideology. Yamashita had implemented the limited engagement that Frank had proposed, but not because he agreed with Frank's strategic analysis. He had done it because Japanese command had redirected his forces to defensive operations in preparation for American advances in the Pacific. Frank had saved Tommy Morrison's life, but Tommy had subsequently been killed in an operation that utilized the intelligence he had delivered. The photographs that had been so crucial to Allied planning had led to tactical decisions that cost more lives than they saved. The ghost war Frank had fought in Burma had been won and lost simultaneously, by both sides and by neither. Standing in the ruins of the command post where he had spent 4 hours as Yamashita's prisoner and tactical consultant, Frank understood something that no military manual taught. In modern warfare, victory and defeat were often indistinguishable, and the price of winning was sometimes higher than the cost of losing. The ghost commander had survived the jungle, the enemy, and his own tactical decisions. But he had paid a price that would follow him for the rest of his military career, the knowledge that professional competence could be more dangerous than amateur incompetence, and that saving lives often required sacrificing principles. Frank Merrill had become a ghost in more ways than one, a soldier who existed in the spaces between loyalty and duty, between tactical efficiency and strategic necessity, between the war that was fought and the war that was remembered. In the end, that might be the most honest way to win a war, by haunting it rather than surviving it, by becoming something that could not be captured or killed because it had already died and been reborn as something beyond traditional military understanding. The ghost commander walked back toward Allied lines, carrying intelligence that would never be fully reported and memories that would never be fully shared. Because some victories can only be won by soldiers who are willing to die to their former selves and be reborn as something the enemy cannot understand or defeat. Frank Merrill had saved 3,000 lives by dying at 0347 hours on March 15, 1944. Everything after that was just professional haunting. The story of Frank Merrill and his marauders represents one of the most complex special operations campaigns of World War II, where traditional concepts of victory and defeat became blurred. In the jungle terrain of Burma, sometimes the only way to win a war is to become something that transcends the war itself, something that can operate in the spaces between enemy and ally, between duty and efficiency, between the tactical and the strategic. Frank Merrill died and lived, won and lost, saved and sacrificed, all simultaneously, all professionally, all necessarily. Because sometimes, in the deep jungle where shadows become substance and ghosts become real, the only way to save lives is to haunt the war until the war itself becomes something different. Sleep well, and remember, the best soldiers are often the ones who die to save others, even when dying means continuing to fight.